Adamsen, and I just had a wonderful discussion with Peter Louch, the founder and CEO of Vemo. Peter has a degree in astrophysics from UC Berkeley. He's had a fantastic journey in his career with Monster and others, which led him to found Vemo in 2005. So he has been at this for a while. His perspective on the evolution of workforce planning and people analytics is unique and insightful and valuable. And it brings us today where the emergence of talent intelligence and skills-based workforce planning and the role of workforce planning and diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives is absolutely key. So he creating a technology company, again, has a very unique perspective on the limitations of technology and the need to have processes so organizations and leaders specifically are ready to adopt the insight to make informed decisions on how they recruit, how they design an org, how they accommodate disruptions from artificial intelligence and robotic automation and globalization and gig economy and all those fun things. So hope you enjoy the discussion with me and Peter. And as always, check us out at pafal.net. And if you're interested in supporting this and other content like it, please consider becoming a member. So thanks for being here and enjoy the discussion. Hi, welcome. I'm here with Peter Louch. Peter, how are you doing?
I'm great, Al. It's great to see you today.
Hey, great to see you as well. I mean, we've known each other for a number of years, my friend, and I was looking at your LinkedIn profile. It's been over 18 years since
18 years.
you have founded Vemo. So I'm very interested, as I'm sure our listeners are, on your perspectives on workforce planning and analytics and how it's evolved over the years. But before we get into that, want to know a little bit about you and your background and what inspired you to get into this field, because your educational background is certainly worth exploring. And I'll let you tee that up because and I'm going to blow it, but as a layman physicist or someone who's interested in the discipline, you actually have a formal education in it and how all the dots fit together and how things work. So if you would introduce yourself and a little bit about Vemo.
Great. Thanks so much, Al. Yeah, it has been quite some time. It's an interesting story arc. I'm from California originally. I grew up in a college town, Claremont, California. Nice place to grow up. And sort of walloped recently by snow nearby, right? That's where all the snows hit so hard in the sort of surprises, Mount Baldy, et cetera. I sort of had a background. I always sort of thought I would be a scientist originally. That was sort of scientist slash musician or whatever. So those are my two key interests. So, in my formative years, you could find me walking up and down Indian Hill Boulevard, um, heading to band practice where I play keyboard, bizarrely reading, The Cosmic Code, which was a book on physics explaining the start of the universe. Very quirky, didn't really fit in, sort of, but it was consistently not fitting in. So that worked for me. I think that's why I learned that if you're not going to fit in, you have to consistently not fit in. You're fine. Don't just bop back and forth between those realms. That's what I did. And originally, um, I had I had a Russian roulette sort of dilemma when I decided to go to school, because I had this one interest in becoming a musician, and that's kind of like what I really want to do, but sort of I felt like it was unrealistic and it's sort of a tough life, and whatnot. And I really like the recording aspect and writing music more than actually the performing aspect of it. But then I also did very well in sort of sciences and math type of topics. So I decided I would only apply to one school. And if I got into that one school, I would take that path. And if I didn't, it's like really bizarre behavior. Like I try to relate it to, my kids today, and they're like, what is wrong with you? I mean, who does that? So I applied to Berkeley, and I actually got in there. So that then took me down that path. So I moved up to Northern California and went to UC Berkeley. I wasn't really sure what I was going to do originally, in the topic, but I took a seminar, on sort of comets and asteroids and extinction of the dinosaurs, et cetera, that turned me on to astronomy. So I settled pretty quickly in astrophysics, which is it's sort of like there's a large physics department and there's a small group of people who do astronomy and physics together, or astrophysics. And that was a topic that it was really interesting to work on for quite some time. And my first really interesting job involving computers was that most undergraduates were still sort of just doing the math and et cetera. But I got a job for a pretty famous professor, Alex Filpenko. He discovered supernova 1987A. He's well known. He is like one of the most popular classes still at Berkeley today. And he hired me to write a program. And this was before, you know, the technology that could easily do podcasts and could do all the things with pixels. They would take pictures of galaxies on large pixelated frames, and you'd have to do math to actually fit a light curve to understand what's happening. And so I wrote a program that would basically analyze pictures of galaxies. And this was like in C+ type of language, and automate the process of trying to understand what is the light curve and therefore how much quote dark matter is there in this. And so I was sort of at that fringe area, like sort of interested in the topic, but really interested in sort of this computer science application to that. And now this would all happen automatically, right? This is goofy stuff. People don't actually believe, like, is this real? No, that's not real stuff. This just happens automatically. But it was my first kind of foray into like, hey, what are the benefits of data automation and doing things and how much error checking? It's 95% error checking and 5% doing, right? In terms of that. So that was a background. And at that point coming out, I didn't really perceive myself in the long-term path of the PhD. I didn't perceive myself as going and getting involved sort of like in the nuclear industry and things like that, which is a common path for that. So I sort of hit the job market and did various things with it, really in sales and in things related to technology. And I eventually ended up kind of going back and forth between New York and San Francisco, and got a company called Austin Knight, which got bought by TMP, which owned Monster.com. And so I was in a sales position for that company, and got involved in the whole recruiting industry. And I was really amazed in this whole recruiting industry, just how people would, they place huge ads or they do these website efforts. There's sort of no measurement. People would just decide randomly, we're going to recruit a lot of people, but there was didn't really seem to be a lot of planning behind it. It was just sort of like a branding and hurry up and look good and type of situation like that. And so I slowly started getting involved with some of these larger customers we worked on in terms of, hey, they might want to actually plan what they do. They might want to be more efficient. They might spend $10 million a year or $20 million a year advertising. So if you're IBM or SAP at the time, you might spend just really this mad money just constantly recruiting because a hiring manager says we need someone. They would cancel that. So how do you start actually thinking about planning it? And the people I work with in recruiting were sort of intrigued by this concept that they could add sort of more value to this in this way. So it's sort of an interesting trajectory, still not really involving the astrophysics piece. So, at that time I developed my key sort of go-to line, which is, this isn't rocket science. I should know, this is not rocket science. So,
it's like you're trying to find the dark matter in recruiting, and there might in fact be some.
There's a lot of it. Yeah.
Hey, so before we go into, because I want to hear what that experience was like with Monster, and how that evolved into workforce planning and people analytics, certainly. Claremont, going back there, were your parents professors? Because if you don't know, if you're not part from California, that's where the Claremont colleges are, Claremont specifically, and Scripps and others. So did you have any affiliation with the universities, your parents, that is?
Yeah, at the time, it was called the Claremont Graduate School. It's now called Claremont Graduate University. My dad was the chair of the philosophy department there. Um, and my mom had a very successful catering business in town that she catered for, the dean of Pomona College and various different entities. And so, one of my actually interesting experience in business is that is we used to cater a lot of parties that Peter Drucker would be at, and so what do you say? Culture eats strategy for breakfast, and I served him breakfast a lot of times because I
That's
worked. That's one of my jobs in high school was working working in the family business. Cutting 1,000 asparagus. Making I used to have some pretty good. I fell down on it now, but I used to have some pretty good bread baking skills where I could make the sheets of bread with the designs that you see like in the window with the little cutout little looks like a wheat plant, etc. Things like that. So I did all that. So
just so
when I was
everyone knows, he said wheat plant.
yeah,
Just for the record. So, wow, that's a skill you might have to bring back. Yeah, it's
I have to bring it back.
that. Yeah, well, good for you. So I had a sense that because going into astrophysics is not something that most just wake up one day and go into, and it sounds like there was a very not only academic, when you talk about your dad being philosophical, thinking big and hopefully, and it sounds like, and I've known you for years, so I imagine, correct me if I'm wrong, created space for you to think more abstractly and open-mindedly. And here you have a mother who is, if she's running a business, has, discipline and, certain levels of regiment to, organizing service delivery and, creating product and all that. So obviously I am writing my own narrative in between the lines here, but how much would you say, given where you are now, when you're talking about these complex systems? And I've long shared that workforce planning and analytics was in a crisis of clarity and creativity and courage to do things differently because we have this inertia from the past. So that upbringing that you have had, do you think it contributed to you being an entrepreneur in this field and actually applying your creativity to bring something new to life?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those. I mean, I think that a lot of things unwittingly. I grew up in a house where I don't think business was given much regard. Actually, it was kind of viewed as academics are where it's at. But I learned certain entrepreneurial aspects. One is that I could never ask like, what does this word mean? I was always told, look it up. So like, I just like used to sit there with this giant Oxford English dictionary, thumbing through it and trying to understand what everything meant. And so I learned a lot of these very entrepreneurial sort of self-discovery aspects because it was an area, it was sort of an upbringing um, where I was always encouraged to sort of think about things. And then also, with what my dad did. He was sort of a leading scholar in constitutional philosophy, which is a really sort of very dense sort of topic, and you're surrounded in Claremont at that time, and it's a little less so. It's sort of built up a little bit more. It's sort of a destination in the San Gabriel Valley to kind of head to, but it used to be like everybody there was in the village was like their parent was this philosopher, that philosopher, um, and or that teacher or professor. Not that many philosophers, actually. Well, in my case, yes. But so it's like you had that experience where you're sort of like immersed, sort of like sort of like a close satellite to all this, this learning. And so I think that is an interesting thing, and it does allow you to sort of take some non-traditional um, approaches to these
Well,
topics.
with that in mind, thank you for sharing. And if so, we go back to Monster, and was it called Monster at that time? And at that stage of your career, and again, I am coming from a very curious place on this. Here you have this big picture thinking. You have the tools from UC Berkeley on how to think and actually how to do stuff. And I'm supposing, and again, I'm shamelessly projecting on this, that there was probably some frustration that, hey, we could do so much more, but we're not, able to do this, or there's not this willingness to make this investment. So, for entrepreneurs, ultimately they say, okay, enough's enough. I'm going to go do something because it's not being done, here. At what point was that? Did it take 5 years? Did it take 10 years? I mean, what did that look like?
Yeah. I think the thing that's interesting is that it was called a bunch of different things because it was a very acquisitive company. Um, I was um, I was a very young manager who rose to be a district vice president. Um, Really too young, and I think I was really much too full of myself, and I made a lot of mistakes along the way. But the reason why I was initially very successful is that this was before they talked about like being like agile and learning agile. I was really flexible. So a very senior executive told me, Peter, internet dollars are worth 9 times more than traditional dollars. So I did the math in my head and I was like, all right, so we could sell this in New York and Boston instead. It'd be this much less, but it'd be actually worth like 5 times more to you. And we should take that risk. And they're like, yeah, do it because we'll be rewarded in the market for that. Um, so I think I was in a fairly solid trajectory there because I had a lot of these frustrations and observations. It was very fast paced and I kept getting more responsibility. And I didn't know what I didn't know. I was just going with it. And then there was a really big meltdown at the company after 9/11, and recruiting industry really just fell apart
Mm.
in a very big way. And in the last days of that really was something of a pressure cooker at the time. And the market became less interested in new ideas.
Mm.
I remember a meeting in which I pitched, "Hey, we have the job postings. Maybe we should give the job postings away, and we should actually be responsible for a global job." I don't think I used the word taxonomy, whatever the right word. I didn't know that term, probably to use that term that way. I thought we
Hmm.
could own like the language of jobs and give
Hmm.
this away. And if we own it, then companies will come to us for this. And then people will really resist them. Like, that's crazy. We would never do something like that. That's an idiot idea. Um, type of thing. So in leaving that environment, I then switched over to a consulting firm for a period of time, that's what really then spurred me towards the ultimate path. So I joined a small consulting firm called Brecker and Merriman that had just been bought by Manpower um, to form the Empower Group. And these were truly great consulting firms. They bought, I think, 10 or 12 of these boutique HR consulting firms that really had one of the best comp firms around that had Cisco as a customer. In Australia, one of the best organizational development firms. In Another one in the Bay Area that was one of the leading sort of OE company and leading early experts in what makes hourly versus salary work or things like
Hmm.
that. And then the one I joined, which was really into branding and recruiting, but the person who was the owner before happened to have started the HR Planning Society along with Jim Walker and had the sort of roots also in this area of workforce planning. So I came in to a company that was also had strong roots in recruiting and recruiting communications and but was looking to get more into these other areas like competencies and planning because of these shifts in the market that was happening. And after I was very confused about what consulting was. I remember I asked the question. I said, "Well, so let me get this straight. We create these elaborate, beautiful PowerPoint presentations and slideware, and then someone brings us in, and then we kind of substitute some of their stuff in it, and then $100,000 later, you know, that's what they get." And they're like, "Yeah, yeah, that's it exactly. Don't overcomplicate it." You know, um, so so that set me on a path where eventually Manpower, the CEO at the time, Jeff Jarrett, pulled together a project where he wanted to create like a theory of everything for Manpower. So I got pulled onto one of these dreaded internal projects called talent value management. Um, And the idea of that project was to basically create an overarching set of an overarching framework to describe sort of the cradle to grave, like everything from recruiting to onboarding to outsourced recruiting to staffing, all the way to onboarding. Because in that time, then they also bought Right Management, which was one of the leading um, out, firms of that type. So I worked on this for quite some time, and it was very interesting. I worked with country managers across Manpower. I worked with the largest customers who were HP, IBM, and Honeywell, who were literally had these sort of hundreds of millions of dollars to spend, and they were looking to start optimizing it, and built like this really interesting framework. Um, and in doing so, I learned a lot about sort of the true area of workforce planning. They brought in, some leading experts, like I mentioned. Jim Walker had written one of the sort of original books that everyone followed. He handed that off to Tom Bechet. So I met a lot of these characters who were influential, but it was interesting because they had written these texts and these approaches in a different time. And in that different time, workforce planning was like, let's kind of on paper burn it all down, rebuild up demand planning from scratch of what we need to do, analyze our supply, and make that decision like if next year or if 3 years from now we should do it. So it was a very sort of strategic endeavor at that time that I was learning about. But I'd also had this experience in this sort of dot com bubble burst, all this rapid change. People were writing all these articles that the future of work was starting to emerge. Workforce 2020 was a key paper that Deloitte had put out that everyone was saying work's going to change. It's going to be, we start talking about gig economy, things like that. So it was very dissonant in terms of like these previous practices that perhaps were considered to be too slow with how fast work was starting to move with the internet, and also it's not even worth planning concepts. Like a lot of people say, it's kind of almost like a dad discipline. I remember that I presented at a brass ring conference early on, and someone said, did someone drop you on your head? Why would you ever want to plan? Things just move too fast. It's just like a waste of time around this. So in doing that, I became frustrated with the fact that that I was sort of responsible for a feature, right?
Hmm.
We're going to go in, we're going to talk to this really large organization, we're going to pitch a bunch of fairly transactional things, and we're going to have, I used to call myself the workforce planning hood ornament. I would be like, we're driving this really nice XYZ car. It's you can't even use the analogies you use with cars. It's all mixed up, right? But it's like it's our blank here. We're going to call it a Mercedes. We're going to put the workforce planning hood ornament on it. It's going to really entice all the people who come in for this pitch, what they want to do. Everyone's going to dissipate. You guys go do the work now. And then it'll be like, hey, maybe next year we're going to get into some of these concepts. Maybe 3 years down the road, this is roadmap stuff. This is fantastic. You keep doing what you're doing. Kind of concept around it. So as I went through that, I found that some of the customers I consulted with all said, actually encouraged me, there should be some sort of technology for this. And one thing you have to learn, my advice for future entrepreneurs is that very few of the people who casually say to you, I'll be your first customer, actually mean it, right? Very few, right? Very few actually mean. I mean, they feel it, but they actually don't think that you're going to say, okay, I'll take you literally. Look it up. Okay, I looked it up. I'm doing it. That just doesn't happen that much. But a couple definitely did, and so that ultimately led to like how to starting Vemo as an entity, where our first customer was the former Bell Labs, so
Hmm.
was Gear Systems. They are now, they're not even, maybe they've been sold several times, as an asset, as this sort of semiconductor, and they had a big challenge around the fact that they were sort of the last the major semiconductor companies to really to offshore their work, where most had. So they had the foundries in the U.S. still. Um, they had more patents than people, by far. Like they had some of the best patents, but they had patents in areas that they didn't even do work in.
Wow.
They had one guy who had 60 patents, and they were all in technologies they had sold off and no longer worked in areas. So that was the first customer that signed up, and we basically bootstrapped into a technology company in that way, really not knowing that much initially about sort of technology, really trying to chasing like this problem. We want to solve this nuanced problem. And one of the ways we want to solve it was that um, we sort of thought this would be a blend of consulting and technology. And we're really going to focus on strategic workforce planning. We thought maybe the rest of the space was sort of well taken care of. There's all sorts of reporting. It's easy enough. I thought it was easy enough to get your turnover report. It wasn't, and it still isn't. Sometimes, if you don't do it. But I thought that, hey, that's taken care of. That's basic stuff. Let's really focus on segmenting your workforce, putting these concepts of segmentation in place. And one of the right when I was starting, one of the persons who encouraged me was there was a sales guy in Seattle, Rich Doherty, super influential to me. He was at Right Management. He happened to be managing customers, but he had this whole other side I don't think he always brought, which was really intrigued by all his strategy books. And he said, when you start your company, I want you to read these 3 books. I want you to actually incorporate some of that. So one of the books he gave me was the Jeffrey Moore book, or from Crossing the Chasm, around how companies build strategic advantage.
Mhm.
So I think sometimes you overshoot your first thing you do. So originally we really overshot. We're it's astrophysics background. Let's go for the moon. Let's go to the stars and beyond. So we thought like, hey, we could actually have software which would help people segment their workforce as part of the strategic workforce planning, and help them figure out which workforces, help them build an advantaged organization based upon like that 16 box model of how you create value as an organization, and then kind of poop out, this is what your talent strategy is. And then executives would be in awe, right, of this whole thing. And we had some cool graphics, really, so really fit in, like with the, 3D sort of like, dodecahedron of like what your talent was, whatever, with the shading and the cross hatching and the stuff like that. And it was really neat. It was really enjoyable stuff. But then when we went and showed it to the next person, they're like, "What are you like? Wow, that's really interesting. What are you showing me? We could,
Yeah.
we're, I can't even imagine when we'll be ready for that. Come back to me in 20 years, type of thing, right?" Um, and so we kind of went down a path where we continued working as a young company on how we started making this a little bit more practical for people to
Mm.
get started in the process. So, but basically that was the genesis Al, where basically doing this sort of consulting and knowing that there were really no tools out there at that time, or very few established tools. It seemed like a great opportunity to jump in knowing it was very early, right? So sometimes you jump in really early and you help create the space, but it was a good thing to do.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It's super fascinating and actually creates some clarity for me because you and I have talked about this in the past in a variety of forums where the technology is outpacing the adoption and business readiness. Uh, and so I would put forth that organizations are workforce planning in this regard, whether they know they're doing it or not. In other words, they're consistently making bad decisions if they're not doing it, but they're doing it in their heads. They're doing it ad hoc. They're not doing it in a disciplined way. And again, correct me if I'm wrong if you think differently. What you're bringing to the fore is that discipline, is that structure by which to set up a process. So okay, we're going to come in here with a specific purpose. We're going to have data and insights that are going to inform how we move forward. So we're not going to do this in a silo, or we're not going to do this ad hoc and just kind of based on gut feel. We're going to bring some data-based insight that's going to help us mitigate risk and increase the likelihood that our investments reap the desired return, whether it be recruiting or org design or what have you. So the focus question is, over the almost 20 years since you founded, Vemo, have you seen the business readiness and adoption of workforce planning uh, increase? And if so, why is that?
Yeah, I think that I feel like in many ways, well, I think there's a few ways to look at it. One is that I think that there are these cycles in business and also in HR technology where a lot of it depends on where you sort of on ramp. So I think there was an initial really hot period right when we joined, where organizations were thinking that they want to do a better job planning, but then there's a pretty big economic collapse, and
2008.
organizations,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
they just disbanded their internal capability in many cases. There were opportunities. There was a lot of interest. There was a lot of people starting to recruit for these workforce planning and people. And it wasn't called people analytics yet. It was sort of bopping around different terms around that. And then a lot of organizations just disbanded their effort. So there was that. So there is part of that whole concept. Um, so but beyond that, I think it used to be that people would ask, like, well, what kind of company would use your company, Vemo, for its work? And I used to always sort of flippantly say it just depends on really the head of HR, of being whether they're into it or not. But now I think that it's emerged over a period of time and it's considered to be really a core pillar of what you do, what you offer in your HR model to the business. And so now I think we're in that realm. Now we're sort of arguing about who owns it a little bit, and how to get it done best, which is a good place to do, to be, as far as it goes. I've seen it evolve. We as a company have seen it evolve a lot, but I've seen it evolve a lot where the sort of excitement of thinking that maybe you're in the perfect time for it, realizing you're not because of this externality of what happened to the economy. Kind of picking up the pieces a little bit, keep on going, and then sort of helping to really grow the field. And so, one thing that's sort of interesting, I'm not a big fan of getting attribution, but I see a lot of things that people talk about that I feel like, I don't know, like I think I might have been the first person who said that or something, or kind of like introduced the idea, or maybe a lot of us did at the same time. But I think that being in this business for a while, we've had sort of an outsized impact in terms of what people think about and do in this area. But we're also fighting against a lot of myths that are
Mm-hmm.
happening,
Yep.
because I think that there's this natural thing where people take this topic of workforce planning and people analytics and they want it to be even bigger than it is. It's already complex, but they want to say every time we have a shortcoming in one of our single threaded HR processes, we're going to say workforce planning might help us with that. It's very unusual that people will put so much in it, and then it kind of got put on a pedestal where it's like, oh, I used to do this topic, but now I do, I'm in workforce planning, and it's sort of like this sort of evolved state of what people do. So people a lot of times start thinking about, oh, we should only workforce plan like 2 job roles in our company that are really critical, and it's all about just being better at recruiting them or things like that, um, or that you have to do these. We have these great models out there. You have to do every element of them. If you don't have the external job market piece and the internal and this piece and that piece, it's not a real program. And you have to go through every step of the process to be successful, as opposed to just basically taking those concepts and overlaying them on what you're doing to make your overall, HR more effective, if you will.
If I'm hearing you correctly, it's effectively an overarching framework to organize, how you think about your talent and your org
Right.
design and, all that. And, I want to talk about the future in a little bit because you touched on it. But before we go to that, I want to understand your definition of workforce planning, because we're talking and we've known each other for years and we have a common language. But if I'm listening, it invites the question: what is strategic workforce planning? What is workforce planning? And related to that, what is people analytics? And before I let you respond, I just want to set the stage a little bit, because historically, at least I've seen workforce planning live in talent acquisition, and it is informed, to your earlier point, recruiting practices and making that more efficient and effective. Yet it has not, in many cases, identified the internal movement, org design. How do you partner with outsourced providers or gig economy? You mentioned that earlier. Increasingly, we have robotic automation and AI. So how we think about the future of work, how an organization actually does work, is more complex, but there's more data to shed light on how that is actually happening. So if we get more systematic and we get the right people in the room looking at common insight, we can theoretically make better, more informed decisions that mitigate risk, that more efficient and effective. So I shared a lot there. But of course, I want your perspective, given that you've actually been enabling this work. So the pointed question again, how are you defining, workforce planning in this day and age? And if you want to juxtapose it over how that definition has evolved, so be it. Please do.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've been two things. It's interesting your viewpoint on the talent acquisition because I came from the talent acquisition background, and then when I started getting the work, and I felt like it was really hard to even get people on the phone. So I used to have a joke, which is like, "Hey, remember when people never get in touch with us and we couldn't reach them? That's because they were in these other meetings with people like the new me talking about workforce planning, and they didn't want to get back to you on your recruiting stuff." So I feel like on one hand, I've always had my eye on the ball in terms of how do we make talent acquisition and recruiting more effective, because I was aware that because I've been aware that it's really an important problem. It's like a very important. It's the front end of your whole employee experience, right? In terms of what's happening, and and I'm aware that so many organizations. It's sort of heartbreaking, the companies who like staffed up in such an extreme way in the pandemic and then just staffed down. And it's like, that's okay. That's what the market expects, because it's just because they knew they had someone there. I mean, these companies are run by really smart people. They had to know they weren't going to need these people long term, but they didn't want to leave dollars on the table. They didn't want to take a more sort of like thoughtful approach. And it's interesting to work in a way in sort of like this cutthroat business world where you kind of think like, hey, there could be a better way, and maybe you would sacrifice a tiny bit of profit, but long term, you'd be built for this long term success. And I think that the pandemic, this is a little bit of a detour, I know, Al, but the pandemic allowed a lot of people to kind of try to throw out some of those squishy, good to work company concepts. But it's not going to behoove them long term, right?
Yep.
When they want the next round, when these companies want to go for the next round of like the truly top talent, and there are sort of companies who are more thoughtful about the employee experience, including recruiting, those other smaller companies will win. You know what I mean? It's known. People
Oh,
don't forget
100%
this,
agree.
right? So, but it's also understandable, right? When people say when you panic, you can go to your go-to behavior. A lot of the stuff is learned behaviors that you're overlaying and, you know, trying to be a little different than your go-to behaviors of sort of the cutthroat business side. But so for recruiting, I always felt like sort of adjacent to it. So although trying to help, I felt like that was not ever our real approach, that we were really trying to integrate with the HR business partner concept of how does HR work more effectively with the business to drive a talent approach that that is holding hands with the business strategy approach. So that's been always what it is. And so I know a lot of folks have thought, well, this is more of like a recruiting aspect because there's a strong recruiting outcome, but recruiting is everybody's business, right? So, and that's everybody's business. This is trying to focus on the overall idea of not just recruiting, but also when do you not replace people when they leave? And how do you move people around more effectively? And how do you mine and leverage your skills more effectively? Um, so then to answer your definitions, for people analytics, starting with it, that's complex because there's a lot of nuances in fields. And there's sort of like anything else, you know, the head of engineering at Gear Systems told me once when I was asking him what the differentiation between different roles, and he said, "Peter, it's 90% test here. Everybody wants to be a strategic system architect. Everyone wants to be this, wants to be that. But guess what? It's mostly test. We try to make it look like not test all the time, but we test and we test and we test. Occasionally we do something new and then we test and we test and we test. So there's a lot of reporting in people analytics, but there are also sort of insights because a lot of people want what's my employee roster? What's that report on basic turnover? What's hiring versus mobility? What are those different things? So people analytics is a summary um, of a large batch of point reporting that people need, but also so an overlay of some like strategic insights they couldn't get naturally. And really good people analytics includes a lot of predictive insights where you're not just looking back, but you're trying to push people to look towards those future points. And it's not cookie cutter. So a lot of organizations do subscribe to like, hey, let's just plug in this kind of cookie cutter platform. It's all pre-built. Every organization is very different. Every organization has very specific practices. So it's really about transforming that data, but then talking in a common language that people can talk about, in terms of these different measures. Workforce planning, to me, the most important aspect of it is demand planning. It's
Mm.
really understanding what you need as an organization. I've long been very passionate about that topic in terms of how can you help organizations really understand what their true talent requirements are that meet their business objectives. And then it's also the heavy duty data mining behind it, which is what is going to happen to our existing incumbents and new hires and people movement that comes around. So what's happening internally, and then what are those gaps, and then how can we then close those gaps? There's definitely a plan, do, measure cycle happening here.
Mhm.
We at Vemo try to operate on the plan and the measure aspect. So the plan, which is like this is producing a really high quality gap analysis, a process for you to work on that gap analysis, and then how do we really hold ourselves accountable, really measure our forecast, measure what's happening, measuring plans versus actuals to allow people to sort of adjust. We're not really in that do area. We're just trying to, like any planning process, we're just really trying to provide a lot of insights, actionable information, quality measurement to adjust to allow people to spend more intelligent time on the do, right? On
Mm.
what they're doing and not just do the scattershot activities of what.
That makes a lot of sense to me, and it's also the case that, and again, I say this too much, but I want to invite you to offer your perspective. And I say what I say too much is correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm catching myself in that. It's this what you're sharing requires that leaders understand the nature of the work that needs to be done and the amount of work that needs to be done, and in turn, the qualifications or skills of those to actually do the work. And I have seen in my personal experience a high degree of variability in the quality in which that work, in defining the work specifically, is done. Many just take a scattershot approach. Many just, you know, for lack of a better term, are lazy about it. They just, okay, this is what I got from finance. So it's a financial orientation as opposed to a true skills based or work based, orientation. So, what are your thoughts on that? On being able to define the work, both in terms of the quantity of work as well as what's going to be required from a skills perspective to do the work?
Yeah. So I've always been intrigued by sort of companies talking about their HR finance dilemma, looking different ways, because all the customers we work with at Vemo, we've seen great collaboration. Often the person who's in charge of our program has worked both in finance and human resource. And I've always felt with finance, they say, I've had CFOs say to me, Peter, this is actually what we've been wanting people to do, but unfortunately, they're not giving this information. So we have to create these constraints in these models, these finance models, because they're not reflecting on what they actually need to get the work done. So I think what workforce planning does is in high demand by finance. For sure, there are variations, and there might be some cases where finance says we don't want HR to do this work, and maybe the leaders are at loggerheads between HR and finance in terms of that way. So there's always the case for that, but we find that that one of the key sometimes people talk about customers workforce planning. We consider recruiting, talent sort of development, finance, real estate to be really important customers of this process of the information. They use this information to help what they do and all their outputs a lot, and to save money and to avoid a lot of overlap. So a lot of times they'll say, "Hey, we had 190 people who are doing work they weren't hired for in finance, and they're not actually working on what they should be because they're spending all the time mired in sort of these spreadsheets and things like that." So um, I mean, I think that sort of answers your question in a way.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And it's also, I just want to put this word on it, at least using my orientation, it's governance. So you mentioned several functions, which in many organizations stay siloed, and there's not an integrated approach, let alone viewpoint on how what I do in this particular function is going to affect the system, whether it be recruiting, learning, org design, and performance even. So having that governance and seeing how the organization ebb and flows over time requires some measurement, requires some planning, and that's what I hear you bringing forth. And one thing before you respond, one thing I just want to enter into the mix, because if I'm listening here, I was like, okay, we're talking about workforce planning, we're talking about people analytics, and then there's a lot of buzz in the marketplace around talent intelligence. So I really want your take too on, is talent intelligence just another naming convention? And, for me, a lot of it is talent market analytics. So what's happening in the external environment relative to what's happening internally. But let's say I consume that insight, it has to enter some process, some governance body, ideally, so good decisions can be made and understanding how it's going to affect the system. So the pointed question again is workforce planning relative to talent intelligence. Your thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, and I'm going to answer that in 1 second, but I was rattling around in my head about what you're talking about, the lazy part, and actually,
I triggered myself. I know I'm going to get some people. Oh, you called me lazy. No, I didn't.
no. But I thought about this because, for better or worse, I have a strong bias for practical. So I really, I really feel a great sense of pride when we're able to get a customer really to do work differently, with this and practical. And I think also a lot of times you have to accept things as they are. So there is aspects where some people, there's some people who are great at this, but there's some people who would be great at it, but they're too busy. Maybe they're lazy. Maybe they're just too busy. They don't have time to think about it. Maybe they haven't thought about it enough to really think about the implications, or they don't have the long-term perspective on it. And there's some people who are just sort of shuffling and struggling with it. They know they need to do it. They're good at other things. And so I've kind of felt like workforce planning is like an organizationally wide thing. And you have to actually help everybody of all these personas I just mentioned. So before getting to the talent intelligence piece, which I think is the advanced part, I would say that as we've sort of remade ourselves several times, I've really pushed to have Vemo be something that would help all those personas. So one of the things is that we believe is that we have a large amount of predictive analytics that actually predict your demand, and then obviously predict your supply. So we don't want people to have to enter anything. We want to allow that person who doesn't have enough time or doesn't really know what they're doing to actually have a workforce plan of demand supply gap before they even enter a one, into the tool, or a two, or whatever like that. But we also want people to have modeling tools who are really into it to be able to review that as an extra voice and say, yeah, but I'm really experienced. I'm really in touch with the business, what we're doing, what our new initiatives are. And I know that we're not going to follow business as usual. So that's been very important to me, to have something that can just kind of almost run, and just that you can rely on that, and it runs with a great frequency.
And sorry to interrupt. What I'm hearing is scenario planning.
Yeah.
So is that another word for what you're describing?
What I'm describing is that if you start off with a workforce plan in the first place, then everything you do from there is actually scenario planning. But if you start off with being like, hey, we're going to provide a framework for you to do scenario planning, then no one even gets the first plan as a company overall, right? So we want to ensure that a customer, that they get to that first plan, that the data comes in, gets processed, it loads, on a Monday, and then Tuesday they actually have a plan, and then they're modeling their plan through scenario planning behaviors. And if they don't have those behaviors, they still have a really good plan, which is better than what they do if they were sort of, creating the artwork, throwing the paint the wall, spaghetti, whatever you call it,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
The second thing is that it also allows you to allow business managers, directors, et cetera, to be planners too. Because honestly, one of the struggles and frustrations for HR people who are working on it is they have all the expertise throughout all the HR domain. They have a really good sense of business, but they're not they can't they can't be 500 people who are each managing a project or an initiative or a component or a product or whatever you might be talking about at that company. So if you can get those people involved into a tool and how the process, they actually know they might need more coaching, they might need more direction in the process, but they actually know or have very specific ideas of what do we need demand wise to do this, and what are we, in being able to know what they're likely to do. That really helps them become engaged and really get the whole voice of the business in the
Mm.
process. And if they're involved, they accept the plan. So if HR or finance has the plan, then you kind of rail against it. You find the loophole, you find how to get what you want anyway. You do your own planning process on the side. If you're brought into the process, then you can't get to the due stage and say, I'm not going to do that plan. It's like, wait, you're not going to do your plan? Why not? What's wrong with your plan? Type of thing.
Right.
So if you want me to, I'll go on to the talent intelligence question, or do you have
Yeah, please, because I want to, when we talk about, because what you just shared is something that, yeah, just to emphasize the practicality. And the practicality needs to be there, not only to your point, the HR business partner, but for the business leader, because they're going to make decisions. They're going to make the final call in most instances, obviously accommodating the talent constraints and the financial constraints. But here's now this emergence of talent intelligence, which sheds light not only on talent markets, supply demand in the external market, but also the visibility of a particular organization relative to that market. So, is that a disruptor for workforce planning? Is that an enhancer for workforce planning? So, your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think it's an enhancer for what it is, and I think that in terms of, the talent intelligence piece, I think that it started as an area where it was almost like a competitive concept, which is like, oh, do we want to do workforce planning where we're looking internally, or do we really want to have all this information and this data at our fingertips? So sort of like the organized concept versus the available, right? So should we do an organized workforce planning effort, know all the stuff, but with the things that we can actually control? Or should we just have really good talent intelligence available, trust people in a sort of low process kind of environment to come and make the right solutions? And so those are almost like competitive. So we've been involved in sort of presentations where like, oh, we're trying to decide which we should do. And you're like, can you do both at the same time? Because that might be a lot more helpful. So now I think there's some convergence happening, and I think they're both sort of valuable because it's always valuable to have data intelligence. But it's really valuable to have a process that organizes all those points and brings it together. So I think this next frontier we're coming to right now is how to get from, I think the first wave of workforce planning was how do you get from sort of cost center based or department based workforce planning to job role, sort of more competent job, more understanding that then it helps you think about how people move around their jobs as well. So that, a lot of times what our customers do is they find out like, okay, we have a gap of 20 in the next year, but guess what? We're a net exporter. So we have a gap of 30, or guess what? We're a net importer. So we have a gap of 10. Those are really big swings and really affect what you do and how you manage things. And they're a bit self-fulfilling. If you typically have been, then you learn how to be that. And then you actually work those well-oiled pathways. And, it's like you go hiking in the mountains, someone's gone through and they, you can only keep on hiking if someone's clearing the paths and kind of going down those some roads again. It's the same notion. So now I think with the talent intelligence idea is, can we start applying that lens internally a little bit, have talent intelligence in terms of what we have? Can we actually learn about some of these things? I mean, a lot of times you hear companies say like, we're convinced we have thousands of people lurking about who really have the skill. Probably not. It will work its way out. If you really did, I think you would be solving that problem that way, but you definitely have some. So I can get more intelligent, learn more about your adjacencies. You're not going to necessarily be able to put person A and person B because they have adjacency, but you'll be able to put person A, in role B much quicker, right? If you know that that's a very adjacent skill, so you can start working on that. And then how do we know what's available externally so we can make better decisions? Companies would like to make better decisions about, should we grow our own or do we have to get from the outside? And you can lose a lot of time. So if you're in a competitive market and you have 6 months, if you lose 3 months wasting time taking the wrong approach, then you're gonna lose on that market in that way.
Yeah. God, it's fascinating, and that invites the question for me as we start to wrap up here. As we move forward in time, and I'm going to ask pretty much the same question, but in two different ways. What are the barriers to workforce planning right now? And another way to frame it is, what's the opportunity cost of organizations not doing workforce planning in this day and age? I mean, here we are at the beginning of 2023. There's disruptions in the economy, politically, there's uncertainty, but there's been uncertainty to a hyper degree, if you will, since the pandemic started a few years ago. So, I mean, I'd like to talk about where we are in the age of perpetual disruption. So for me, workforce planning is essential. Otherwise, you can't flex and adjust, at speed and at scale. But again, what are some of the blockers to it, and what do you see? And on the other side of the coin, if organizations are doing it, how are they benefiting?
Yeah. So I think that to answer your question, I think that if you want to be a leader in the industry, you have to do it. Now, there are a couple exceptions. I'm going to go back to my Jeffrey Moore sort of 16 square model, that if you're truly in that magic square where you're, an innovator and you're new to your space, you can get away with a lot, right? You can get away with not doing this. You can hire like, mad, some of these companies are just hiring like mad. It just worked out because they were onto something, and there's a lot of room for error, most organizations don't have that much room for error, you know what I mean, to be competitive. So if they want to be really competitive, you can't really be competitive if you don't have a really good handle on what you have internally and what you need. And you can't have certain shortages to get the work done. So I think that you need to have it. I think some of the barriers going forward are just that to kind of putting some of the technologies ahead of the process, right? So I think that a lot of people will think there's always this nice thought that there's some magic AI, ML, et cetera. The chat, let's not invest because in 5 years we'll be able to ask Chat GPT. They'll tell us what they do. Very cool tool. The most interesting thing I saw so far in analytics is someone got it to generate a poem of what it was like to be the loneliness of being a people analytics professional. which I did a great job of. Um, so, but I mean, I think these tools are great, but they need to serve the greater process, what it is. And I think I think there's always that thing is like, how do you then keep on updating your processes? So I think and that's a neat thing about being in the solar technology space. Um, if you find the right technology as a company to trust, they're then thinking about these things and they're constantly looking at everything and evaluating and deciding when to jump in. And I have my own experience with skills where I kind of refused to jump in for some time because I just felt like I was hearing nonsense out there in terms of what people are doing. It just seems so disorganized. And then with the practical thing kicking in, I was seeing it getting cleaned up a little bit more, and not really yet ready. But then thinking we have to do more to make people ready in this field, right? This is going to be really important. We have to provide that guidance. We have to provide that process orientation around getting that done. And so I think that's basically it. I think it's keeping your eye on the ball. Um, don't rely on your previous success, doing this work, and then just keep on sort of innovating in sort of small ways, to leverage more, and do a better
Yeah.
job.
Well, I got one more question about the future of workforce planning and analytics, and then we'll get to a rapid fire question. And this is something that I know we're going to talk about more here in the future, and the role of workforce planning in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So can you provide your perspective on how it enables inclusive and diversity initiatives to gain traction and be measured and monitored over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the whole plan, do, measure, and adapt kind of thing that we talked about. Workforce planning, one of the key outputs is it really helps you actually also project the future diversity of your workforce, the gender diversity, racial diversity, workforce, depending upon where you are in the world. Um, and it highlights where people set goals which are unobtainable too. And it helps them think about how do they change unobtainable goals to obtainable goals.
Yeah.
So I think we have a big role in that. And we've had a couple of customers who have really taken this to heart, and they've looked at our predictive model and says, what does our predictive model say about our future diversity? And is this what our goals are? And they might benchmark, is what our goals are. What do we need to do differently? Where are the hiccups? Where are those? And really understanding those pockets of success versus lack of success. And then I think also they will plan, and they can also know if they make big decisions, especially as job automation comes on board and other things, it affects different workforces in uneven manners. And so I think in uneven manners, so you can actually get ahead of these problems and say, hey, we're going to be doing this, and this will actually, ideally, right, increase our workforce diversity. Or in many cases, this will actually have a negative impact on what we've been working at and work against it. And then by getting ahead of it, then you can sort of start thinking about, a better way or
Yeah.
how to address it. So I think it's a key voice in it. It doesn't do the do part, right? But the planning enables that measurement that allows organizations to really adapt and do this work more effectively. And that's how we can contribute.
Well, thank you for saying that. I mean, for my money, I don't know how it's done. I don't know how DEI is done in a sustainable way without workforce planning. That's
Right.
that's my bias and 2 cents on it. So thank you for sharing. So you ready for the rapid fire questions, my friend?
Sure am. I am.
All right, and you touched on this at the outset, which I'm very interested in your answer as a result. What is your favorite genre of music?
Oh, well, my favorite genre of music is, I'm I'm one of those old timers who's not an old timer. I really just like I like what's new, and I like to listen the heck out of it when it's new and then put it aside. So it really just varies. I love going to concerts with my kids. It's a lot of fun to do things like that. So um, coming up, we're going to go to a festival in Pasadena to see MGMT and Yeah Yeah Yeahs and some other bands. I think we're gonna go see Half Alive too. So just kind of rolling it out. So it really varies. I like what's new a lot. I like a lot of. I play guitar still a lot. And so I'll be, I like music for the ages, but I like it new.
All right. Well, love that response. And you started to answer question number 2. What do you do for fun? It sounds like obviously you go to concerts with your kids.
Yeah, I go to concerts. Post-pandemic, the work in HR technology has changed a lot. There used to be a lot of travel, a lot of requirements, and a lot of the work is more virtual. HR is remaining more virtual. So I'm leveraging the opportunity to do more personal travel. So love to travel personally. Um, um, like to go a lot of good workout, healthy regime. Like to go surfing. You can find me at Pipes in Encinitas there if you want to know
Nice.
where to find me later. Hopefully not enough, but like to go bike riding. So a lot of active things and travel. Just got back from a weekend getaway in New Orleans. That was a lot of fun.
Good
So
for you.
yeah.
Good for you. All right, couple more. Who is your inspiration or inspirational people? They could be authors, they could be other in your personal life, but who inspires you?
I would say it's really a variety. I was thinking about this a lot about before, but I think I like to take inspiration from just a lot of different sources all the time and just like little bits. So I think that I am inspired. Like some of the things I was thinking about. You're asking the questions about my childhood. I'm inspired by certain things that my parents did. I'm inspired by some of these different sort of business authors. Um, I'm inspired by sometimes reading like a fictional book, that will really just like capture like the nuances of like what things are really like. I mentioned a couple people who I work with earlier in my career. Um, um, I mentioned that the guy Rich Doherty, who influenced me with the books he read. Christina Banks, who's a lecturer at UC Berkeley, who's very influential in my career and helped me think through a lot of these things. And I'm inspired a lot also by the staff I work with and the customers. A lot of things they come up with. I really enjoy those relationships and just asking them like what they think about something and having those kind of conversations. That's what really allows you to keep on doing this kind of work. Um, and I was going into this. I was a little bit inspired also, or maybe a lot, Al, by sort of some of the work that you're doing, because I've been thinking a lot about how you talk a lot about the importance of the ethics of everything and people analytics doing the right thing and for good. And in the field I'm in, a lot of times it could get kind of dark, right? A lot about cut here, do this, do that. So I've tried to think about like how like, am I doing good? Am I doing what I do? I like to make the world a little better place. So how do we actually help people do better for that? And so I've been inspired by that as well recently and thinking about that concept. So I like to take from a lot of things and what people are doing and try to bring them in internally in that way.
Well, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for the call out. And the final question: what are your hopes for workforce planning and people analytics, moving forward? And again, that can be a huge answer, but just your key theme of what your hopes are for the next 12, 24 months or so.
Yeah, my hopes are that we're seeing a lot of interest in the field because of all the uncertainties. My hopes are that people realize that the uncertainty is the name of the game, and that fast, actionable planning, will be like a key to this. And so that it'll be an area. There's a lot of people have seen its slow evolution. So there are the naysayers, like, is this, something, does it float? Whatever, is it? And yeah, it does. It's a really valuable thing. And so my hopes are it just continues that natural growth of the 12 to 24 months, that natural growth where more and more organizations do it. There's sort of, hopefully I, maybe inspire people to really think about it a little bit more in a more holistic way. And then longer term, I do really think this will end up being one of these key pillars of HR as it finds its way, and key pillars of business, in fact, as it goes forward. But I think that's a longer term proposition. For now, I'm just looking for that natural evolution, continue to create more value and more centered around people focusing that way.
Well, love it. We're on that mission together, my friend. So, hey, Peter, thank you for sharing. Closing comments, and how can people learn more about you and what you're doing there at
Oh
Vemo?
yeah. So we're obviously we're working with your organization. They can find us in the member area. I'm look me up on LinkedIn as well, and then we also have a YouTube channel at Vemo Workforce where we are starting to publish a lot of content around how to do predictive modeling in areas like attrition, mobility, skills, diversity, inclusion, and also some of the previous interviews and talks I've done either with customers and things like that. So it's a great way to kind of get some snippets and some content as we try to sort of give back and sort of provide education in what we do, and or see what pipes.
All right. Well, Peter, again, thank you for sharing. Thank you for being your awesome self. We'll see you on the beach and in the water soon, and have fun with your family. So, again, thanks for sharing. You be well. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Al.
Thank you for listening to the People Data for Good podcast with me, Al Adamsen. To listen to or watch more great content, please visit pafal.net. There you will find more podcasts, training videos, product demos, and the like. You will also see our list of upcoming events around North America and Europe. You'll also see who's sponsoring the PFAO community. And I want to thank all of those organizations and, of course, our members. Again, without you all, we'll not be able to do podcasts and the training videos and demos and all the things that we do to help support the community. So thank you all. Finally, your involvement will continue to help us promote people data for good. That is promoting the ethical and responsible use of people data analytics and AI for the benefit of individuals first and foremost, teams, groups, organizations, and society at large. Again, thank you for listening, and please continue to make great things happen.